All right. Well, hello and welcome to everybody. My name is Dan Tulapa, and I serve as the Associate Dean for Equity, Outreach, and Faculty Development within the Graduate School of Education here at Cal Lutheran. It's a pleasure to have all of you joining us today for our first lecture in our GSOE Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Justice, and Belonging lecture series for the spring 2025 semester. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to acknowledge the lands on which we gather today. We acknowledge that California Lutheran University resides on the traditional territory and unceded lands of the Chumash people. We remember their connection to this region and give thanks for the opportunity to live, work, learn, and pray on their traditional homelands. In their footsteps, we carry forward their tradition of coming together to grow as a community. We offer our respect to their elders and to all Chumash people, past, present, and future. I want to also provide some key information for everyone before we get started. Today's talk is being recorded and will be posted soon to our website as a helpful resource. At the end of today's talk, we will have an opportunity for you to ask some questions. We do ask that you reserve conversation in the chat just for your questions, which will be posed to Dr. Templeton at the end of her presentation. You can send those to me directly in the chat via private message or post them publicly. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Dashe Templeton, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Leadership here at Cal Lutheran. Dr. Templeton graduated summa cum laude with a PhD from Florida State University. She is an American Research Association Fellow, a Scholars Strategy Network Fellow, a Ford Foundation Fellow, and a Philanthropic Educational Organization Scholar. At Cal Lutheran, she teaches doctoral level courses on quantitative research methods and educational policy. A native of Los Angeles, she is a proud Afro-Latina with Taino ancestry and has a spouse and three children, ages 7, 6, and 3. At this time, please help me welcome Dr. Dashe Templeton.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Um, I'm so nervous I could just faint, but I'm happy to see some familiar and new faces. Can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
All right. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so my name is Dashe. Thank you so much for this introduction, Dr. Tilipa. I'm going to be talking to you today about the immovable veil of Black disability, which is an introduction to Black disability threat theory, which is a theory I put forth, and I apply it to the school to prison nexus, which I'll explain what that is in a minute. Okay, so before we started, I wanted to start off with a quote that I think is really poignant and sort of captures the political climate today. So among the prizes at stake in the endless war of politics is history itself. The battle for power is always a battle to determine who gets remembered, how they will be recalled, where and in what forms their memories will be preserved. In this battle, there is no room for neutral parties. Every history and counter history must fight and scrap and claw and spread and lodge itself in the world, lest it be forgotten or forcibly erased. All history in this sense is the history of empire, a bid for control of that great expanse of territory, the past. So I thought that was really powerful and kind of goes to show that right now we're being very brave talking about critical theories, which are under fire right now from the Trump administration. So I just wanted to start off with that quote. Okay, so while we're getting situated, to the left is the paper, QR code for the paper, and to the right is the QR code for the presentation. Hopefully you can access that. And while we're kind of downloading those or getting ready, I don't know if you want to follow along with the presentation, but I thought in the chat we could drop in our pet peeve, something you are celebrating, and your favorite childhood cartoon. So my pet peeve is jaywalkers, as many of you know, and not using your turn signal when you're making a right. And then something I'm celebrating is this moment with you. And again, just us being brave and holding space for the disabled and Black communities. And then your favorite childhood cartoon. Mine's was Scooby-Doo, even though I'm a chicken. And I was Scooby-Doo and my cousin was Shaggy. So if you just want to drop in the chat some of those and I'll also drop the link for the paper and the presentation. Humans, okay. That's awesome. I love that. Yeah, awesome. Muppet babies. Snow in my shoes. Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else? Powerpuff Girls, love that. Talking in movies, true. Oh, my Proposal Defense, congratulations. Dogs not on leashes. Yeah, I hear you. Also turn signals. Okay, cool. So we're just gonna move forward. Thank you so much for everyone who shared. Um, all right, so kind of a roadmap for today is a little bit about me, a little bit about my theory, some time to workshop your ideas, and some time for questions. Okay, so these are three of my four boys. I also have my spouse who was too shy to have his picture up. But to the left, you have Harlem, in the middle is Slade, and to the right is Macon and our dog Billy, who's no longer a puppy. And two of my sons have disabilities, and that was kind of a major reason why I did this theory, because I thought about them in school and how I homeschool them because I didn't want them to be criminalized in school. Okay, so some of my identities that Dr. Tilp already mentioned, so I'll just share that probably the most important for this theory is that I identify as Black and disabled. I'm bipolar. And then a little bit about my expertise. I believe that without theory, science and society can't move forward. Like critical race theory, which gives you a lens into racism and other systems of oppression. One of the theories I'm working on is stratified economics of education with my graduate assistant, Ruslan Korchagan, who's now a doctoral candidate. And we just talk about the penalties and the privileges associated with being Black American in schools versus being white American in schools. And then another one I'm working on is two spirits criminology. So we have indigenous criminology, which talks about the process of being criminalized because you're indigenous. And then we have two spirits queer criminology, which talks about criminalization processes associated with being queer. But we don't really have one that talks about the two, even though the two spirits, like the first incidents of violence against queer persons happened to quote unquote cross-dressers who were two spirits. The other thing I do is critical quantitative research. So I look at large scale data sets like the California Department of Education and do analysis to see how they impact things like expulsion and suspension rates. I also do experimental surveys and look at how the public would view school personnel performance ratings, like how they would rate school personnel as it relates to discipline outcomes. And the last thing I do in terms of quantitative is public opinion on things like anti-trans bathroom legislation, restraint and seclusion, and corporal punishment to kind of see what the public thinks about those things, the American public. The last thing I do is critical qualitative research, and I interview students, teachers, principals, and superintendents on their experiences with the school to prison nexus, and also physical fitness, which I think is really important. And we need to mandate and increase physical fitness in the US for students. Okay, so disability. When I'm talking about disability, I'm talking about the social model, not the medical model. An example of this is that for the medical model, it's the idea that you have some kind of innate inferiority. You're identified as disabled instead of self-identifying as disabled or being disabled because of society. Something you can think about is for those of us that wear glasses, we might have been considered disabled by society because we couldn't see, but with the advent of glasses, which is a social accommodation, now we can see we're no longer considered disabled. Another thing, if those who use wheelchairs don't have access to ramps for buildings or door openers, they're disabled socially as opposed to medically. And then when I talk about the school to prison nexus, I'm talking about a system of oppression that's very multifaceted and complex that shunts, certain marginalized communities from the school playground to the prison yard. And way you can think about that, you've probably thought about it, is the school to prison pipeline or the school to prison pathways. And that just, as opposed to thinking like a pipe or multiple pathways, you can think of it like a bird cage. And yeah. And then when I talk about Black American, I'm talking about Americans who share a unique experience because of their culture, skin color, hair texture, facial features, and history, chattel slavery, the new Jim Crow, the old Jim Crow, and the Black codes. Okay, so let's talk about Black disability threat theory, which I'm calling the immovable veil of Black disability. So the major thrust of the work is that there's threats from all sides, that as someone who's Black and disabled, we're not accepted in the Black community, which historically and currently has wanted to disassociate itself from disability, or the disability culture, which is historically and currently white property. And so we're not welcomed in these spaces and there's threats from every direction. The other main part of this is an intersectional lens, this idea that there's no single issue oppression, and we're not free unless we're all free. And then standing on the shoulder of giants, this work wouldn't be possible without the foregrounding work of critical race theorists, disability critical race theorists, Black critical race theorists, and racial threat theorists. And then this work is based off of interviews with prominent thought leaders and advocates, disabled Black activists and authors and nonprofit owners and things like that. And it's also based off of literature reviews, so policy briefs, research articles, and things like that. Okay, so there's 10 key tenets of the Black disability threat theory, and hopefully I'll make it all in the time that we have. So let me talk about the first one. So the first one is this idea of subhumanization. So historically and currently society, especially non-disabled white Americans, considered Black and disabled Americans subhuman and consequently subject to various forms of degradation. And this subhumanization was a precondition for their oppression. So examples of this include disabled Black slaves who were beat or neglected or murdered. They were also sold to circuses to put on display or sold to medical professionals to be experimented on. And then slaves were also disabled if they tried to run away, so severed hamstrings. They were also, non-disabled slaves were also disabled if they tried to become literate, so they lost their forefingers. Non-disabled slaves were accused of having drapetomania or rascalicity, which is a tendency to run away. And then another example of this is the continuation of slavery for free disabled Black slaves who weren't allowed to leave, who couldn't leave the plantation after slavery ended. And then a more contemporary example is these subhumanizing conversations, comparing Black people to apes and monkeys and disabled people to chimpanzees and dolphins. And this idea that if they don't have the same amount of cognition as a dolphin, should they even be allowed to live? So there's actual research about that. Okay, so I didn't want this to be so deficit. I wanted it to be empowering and kind of give us some direction. So to that end, I came up with some research and policy ideas. So again, there's a lot of experiences about subhumanizing experiences of Black American children and disabled children, but we don't readily conceptualize or evidence disparities associated with the intersection of both, which impacts, I think it impacts interventions, because if we only focus on, for example, anti-Black biases or anti-disability biases, we miss a keen opportunity to have some intersectional interventions. And a lot of times, bias interventions are ineffective if you look at the research on it. And maybe one of the reasons is because it's a single issue approach as opposed to an intersectional approach. Okay, so moral panic. This is the idea that society considers disabled Black American persons threats, which increases outgroup anxiety and evokes a kind of moral panic. So a major example of this is state-sanctioned violence and murder against disabled Black people in society and schools. You'll find that in research, most of the people who are subject to corporal punishment, restraint, and seclusion, which are physical acts of violence that are permitted by the state, that's why they're called state-sanctioned, are disabled Black children, excuse me. And then many doctors argued that freed slaves were going more insane post-freedom, and that was an excuse to enslave them or put them in prison, or were prone to certain types of illnesses like schizophrenia. Okay, so what can we do about moral panic? I think one of the things we can do is look at nuances between treatment and designation, special education designations. So there's two lines of research. One of them says that if a teacher gets to know a Black American student more holistically, discipline disparities are reduced. So for example, the teacher learns that the student can play the trumpet or that they have 3 siblings. As opposed to kind of nascent research that talks about how special education teachers with a greater familiarity with disabled persons are actually more likely to be biased towards them. So we need more research on kind of the nuances of these findings and what happens when you put them together. So most identifiable, this has to do with colorism and saneism. So this is the idea that society considers the darkest of Blacks and the most, quote, obvious disabilities as the most serious of threats. An example of this in real life that's contemporary is disabled Black Latinos are denied vocational rehabilitation acceptance, which is a type of disability service, more compared to disabled white Latinos. So even though they're both Latinos, if they're of darker skin, they're kind of denied this service that's provided to white Latinos. So some things we can do is get more research on different types of disabilities and different types of ethnicity. So this theory is very like black, white paradigm, but we need more than that. This was just a kind of a first step in that direction, but we need more on types of disabilities like kids with autism who versus kids with Tourette syndrome, Black Latino persons compared to Black Palestinian persons. Okay, so formal social control. Americans resort to formal measures of social control to reduce the number, success, and power of disabled Black persons. An example of this is that post Brown versus Board of Education, that landmark case that pushed for integration, quote unquote, pushed a lot of white American teachers didn't want Black Americans in their classes, so they pushed them to special education classes. And unlike segregation based off of color, which is not allowed anymore, segregation based off of disability is allowed. Another example of this is broad discretionary policies like zero tolerance policies. So this idea that you can get in trouble for using your cell phone to the same extent you get in trouble for a fight, even though cell phone in class, even though those are two different behaviors. Another example is manifestation determination reviews, which is a type of policy that helps determine whether a child's misbehavior was due to their disability. And research shows that this disproportionately protects disabled white American children over disabled Black American children, even though they're exhibiting the same behaviors. So what can we do? We can increase the amount of medical support staff that are on campuses. 14 million students attended schools with cops but no counselors because schools spent their limited funding on increasing officer presence, sworn police officer presence, and school resource officer presence, which actually has been shown to increase school discipline instances and reduce students' feelings of safety. Another thing that I thought we could do is have trained medical staff be first responders instead of sworn police officers for issues having to do with disability. And that might reduce the amount of, trauma, injury, death, murder of students with disabilities who are Black. And this has been applied at the state level or the local level, and has had some success. And I want to know what would happen if we did it at the school level. Okay, so this is kind of the opposite, this idea of informal social control. So Americans resort to informal social control to reduce the number, success, and power of Black disabled persons. So chattel slavery was possible and justified through disability medical models. This idea that Africans were inherently disabled and required an overseer. And then again, things we've talked about already, racialized and ableist violence like corporal punishment, restraint, and seclusion are disproportionately used on disabled Black American children over any other racial or ability group. So what can we do? So right now, disability advocates demand advancements in legislation towards regarding, restraint and seclusion. So require documentation, subsequent audits, because what is happening is that we're finding that people aren't actually documenting the amount of times they use corporal punishment or restraint and seclusion, which can lead to, trauma, injury, and death. Implicit bias training, but again, it's very focused on disability instead of being focused on, kind of this intersectional approach. And then teacher training on use of restraint, which a lot of police departments and psychiatric hospitals require, but schools don't require. There's also a discrepancy between who's allowed to use restraint and seclusion and how it can be used. Can you use duct tape and zip ties? Can a bus driver do it? Can a teacher do it? We don't have any requirements in that kind of language about what is allowed and what's not allowed. And then timestamps on seclusion. So a kid can be in seclusion for hours without being checked on. So these are critical advancements, but most of them are colorblind. So what would happen if we had an intersectional approach? Could it improve the success of implicit bias training? And then, unlike suspensions and expulsions, well, I call for the abolishment of corporal punishment, but if you're going to have corporal punishment in the 23 states that allow it, I think we need more stringent requirements for documentation and then also allow for due process. Okay, so hypersexualization and harassment. This is kind of paradoxical. So on the one hand, society considers disabled Black persons sexual deviants and worthy of harassment or culpable. And on the other hand, they consider disabled Black persons as asexual or perverse for wanting a sexually fulfilling life. An example of this is forced sterilization for disabled Black Americans up and through the 1960s. And then there's a lot of research again on Black American girls and boys being considered sexual deviants, and then disabled children being considered sexual deviants. So what can we do? We need more grassroots efforts that help normalize sexual desires and experiences of disabled Black American persons. A great example of this is Sins Invalid, and this is led by disabled people of color, and it's performance work, but they also have educate the public. So they have a coloring book, a disability justice primer, a film, and curriculum. And such organizations promote a healthy and sexual view of disability as it intersects with other identities like race and gender. So it's not just focused on one thing or two things. It's focused on this intersection of a lot of different things. Okay, so 7, segregation and isolation. So this is the idea that society pushes disabled Black persons to the fringes of society. Examples of this are overrepresentation in alternative schools, mental health institutions, special education classes in prison. This is also, and this is based off of the interviews of my own experience, is that disabled persons are excluded from disabled activist spaces, which are predominantly driven by white American activists. And they're asked to focus on their disability, not their race. And they're also, again, excluded from the Black community because historically, if you were disabled, you could be put to death. And that, Black Americans are just as reticent today as they were back then to be associated with disability. So what can we do? There's a lot of research up until 2023 that talks about how disabled Black American children are overrepresented in special education. The recent research shows that maybe that's not so true. It's mixed. So we need more research on kind of, are they overrepresented in behavioral disabilities like ADHD or oppositional disorder, or are they not? And then another thing based off of the research that I'm doing is that a lot of disabled Black American children don't have any friends because, again, they're excluded from both communities. So how can we increase the friends that they have? Okay, so intersectionality, we've kind of talked about this, but this is the idea that race and ability intersect with other forms of systemic oppression, such as classism, fat phobia, genderism, nationalism, and sexism. An example of this that's contemporary is that society rarely considers overweight disabled Black American persons as victims of violence, despite compelling evidence like the state-sanctioned murder of Eric Garner and Barbara Dawson at the intersection of racism, ableism, and fat phobia. So I think there's a lot of anecdotal evidence and theoretical orientations that suggest that individuals within the Black diaspora experience prejudice differently. But there's little peer-reviewed research on the topic of as it intersects with disability. So again, more research on nuances. And then compulsory whiteness and compulsory able-bodiedness. So this is the idea that whiteness as property ensures that humanity, intelligence, normative behaviors all belong to white Americans only, currently and historically. And similarly with compulsory able-bodiedness, this ensures that it's both moral and preferential to be non-disabled and white. An example of this is that we're less likely to see disabled Black Americans in gifted education. So what can we do? I think we can have more comprehensive and culturally responsive multi-exceptional frameworks to increase representation and research on disabled Black Americans in gifted education. And the reason this is important is because gifted education, students that are in gifted education have higher increased, and better life outcomes. They have higher economic privileges. They're more likely to get a job after they graduate. They're more likely to graduate. They're more likely to go to college. So we need ways to dismantle barriers in identification and designation to gifted education. And then the last one is this idea, the main kind of idea is that, we need concrete and cautious interventions that are necessary to reduce penalties associated with being simultaneously Black and disabled. And you might be thinking that's not possible. But there are policies in place that do that. So an example is that the government passed legislation and enacted policies to reduce racially minoritized representation in special education, which has been known to be a problem. For example, local educational agencies like schools must report on disparities. And if disproportionality is evident, they must allocate 15% of their funds to early intervention programs, specifically for racially minoritized youth. Another thing we can do is increase funding and research on grassroots activism, abolitionist movements, and nonprofits, which help people mobilize against police violence, raise awareness of the penalties of being Black and disabled, and promote mixed ability in racial organizing, such as Sins Invalid, which we talked about, HERD, and Change Cadet. Another example of this is that Disability Studies Quarterly, another intervention we can do is that Disability Studies Quarterly released a research-based Black disability studies pedagogy, which should be implemented in schools and researched. And I think there's a critical need for more research on and personal narratives of the lived experience of disabled Black persons, published and disseminated in major presses. Um, Another thing we could do is abolish suspension and expulsion for disruption and defiance, especially for preschoolers, which disproportionately impacts disabled Black people. Also, it's well documented the income and wealth penalties associated being either Black or disabled, and policy interventions meant to remedy them. But there's less research on conjunction of the two. Okay, so thank you for sitting through that. If we could just have a 2-minute free write. So, thinking, grab a paper, a pencil, or your keyboard, and think about which research directions and our policy interventions do you think could improve the lives of disabled Black Americans? Another way to think of this is how can policy and research be used to empower disabled Black Americans instead of constrain them? So I'm going to give you 2 minutes to do that, and then we're going to break up in groups, and you have a chance to share with your group, but you don't have to share with the general group. Okay, so 2 minutes. All right, 1 more minute. Thank you so much for participating in our talk and our workshop. And does anybody want to share about what they talked about?
I can share.
All right.
Hey Dashay, how you doing?
Good. Better now that
All
it's
right.
over.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation. It's making me think about, so I have some thoughts, wonderings, and then I would like your perspective on some things given
Sure.
your work. So it made me think a lot, your work made me think a lot about inclusion. So thinking about formal social control and segregation, those two big buckets that you discussed, and thinking about what it looks like for schools to truly be inclusive, right? Because what came up in my group was this idea of like how we constantly categorize and we track students.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, what does that mean for policy in terms of what inclusion is defined as, right? Because IDEA does not give us a kind of definition of inclusion that is really inclusive, um, because it's open to interpretation, yada, yada. But then what does that mean for teacher education programs? Like, how will we leverage your framework to think about how we might redesign teacher education programs to think about students with disabilities, but also to think about the multiple intersections that all students come with. What does that look like? And then thinking about like when we talk about inclusion and thinking about policy, right? What does true inclusion look like in schools? And does that mean, well, in my mind, I'm thinking a complete redesign of what's
Yeah.
actually. So those are some of the things that came up and some of the things I've been thinking about.
Yeah, no, I definitely am thinking about that too and still trying to find answers. I'm doing one of my students is doing a policy analysis of like how we designate students to special education and how we can do like an overhaul in how we do that, especially for like emergent learners, emergent language learners who are also disproportionately assigned to special education. Um, so yeah, I'm still thinking about that. I'm also thinking about that like can you dismantle what is it, the master's house with the master's tools? And this idea that even though Black Americans and like freedmen had a such a hand in creating public education at public expense, I wonder if it's not for us. That's why I but I homeschool my kids, but you can't homeschool everybody, unless we increase more funding for that. But yeah, I'm not sure I have the answer for what true inclusion looks like or what it would mean for teacher education. I think that, yeah, when I think about teacher education, I think about things like that are still being tested, which is like bias training, which has been so ineffective. And I wonder if it's because it's so one or the other. It's either gender bias training or it's race bias training. There's very little on disability bias training, but there's like nothing on intersectional bias training. But I wonder what would happen if we did something like that. But yeah, I'm not sure. But that's a great like thing to think about, and I'll definitely be thinking about it.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. And we can also open up for questions. So if you have any questions or comments or things you'd like to share, things you're thinking about, we have a couple more minutes.
Actually, our group just talked about the timing of everything right now and how every day is evolving in terms of like national policy.
Yeah.
And so the work that may have been started in some places may not continue in the same way. And we talked in our group about, living in California where mostly educators are protected from continuing to do the work they believe is necessary. But interesting timing because ironically enough, I think who might be like Cal Lutheran being a private institution might be a bit safeguarded against any crazy legislation that might get passed that threaten funding, right? Because
Right.
private institutions may be immune from some of that, which is weird to think about for me in
Yeah.
the K-12 space because private institutions, about 50% in our state are affiliated with, religious institutions. So, our group was just talking about how interesting the next period of time is going to be for policy and work in this arena, and the fact that you wouldn't necessarily think California Lutheran University is a place where that could continue to progress, but it likely will be a safer place than a Cal State Northridge, for example, if crazy policy comes through.
Yeah, I'm so grateful to be here. Um, and I definitely think about California, like the Scholar Strategy Network, which is a network that helps research impact policy so it doesn't just stay being read by the same 5 people that are in academia and helps it, be jargon free and universal. It's a really great program that I'm a part of. But I was thinking about my involvement with them and how originally I wanted to talk about corporal punishment in Mississippi. But then I was thinking about California and how there are still bans on critical race theory in California. And, that Los Angeles is the car serial capital of the world. So more people get arrested here per capita than like any other place. And that we still have a lot of work to do, even as a bellwether state that got rid of, for example, subjective infractions for discipline, so like suspension and expulsion for things like disruption in class. So yeah, we're definitely a bellwether state that's doing a lot of big things, but we still have a lot of room to grow. But I'm really grateful to be part of this institution because I feel protected and like also not just protected, but also like galvanized to action and like really supported.
Dr. Templeton, we did get a private question sent in. So, actually two. So, what research methods, qualitative, quantitative, or mixed, might best measure the moral panic linked to Blackness and disability? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Wow, what a great, powerful question. I think that probably qualitative research makes the most sense. And for questions like that, just to kind of, there are some studies that do like outgroup anxiety, like scales. So like you do an experiment. So you can do a scale where you have like an anti-ableist scale. So like, for example, you might ask questions like people with disabilities have the same rights as people without disabilities, or people with disabilities are behind because of their own choices. So you might have like a scale where you ask those kinds of questions, but again, there's like a disability one and a Black one and not like a one together. And you might also do an experiment where you have like a dark-skinned person with Tourette syndrome versus a light-skinned person with autism, and you have like a video where you show them or something. Like you can do an experiment where you kind of manipulate the disability and the skin tone and see what happens with outcomes. But I think the best way to get moral panic is to ask really poignant questions and get qualitative research back. So I always wanted to do qualitative research. I did quantitative because I wanted to get a job, and someone had told me that that was the only way I was going to get a job, which isn't true, but it's kind of true. Um, it's like a weird paradox, but I love qualitative work, and I think it's really, really important. And policymakers actually really enjoy qualitative work because it's the stories, and you can sell them on a story. So where I thought that statistics made more sense, I think that that's different now that I'm part of the Scholar Strategy Network. I'm learning more about how actually qualitative research is better for that.
That's great. The second question is, if you were sort of giving advice to teachers, counselors, folks like on the ground in schools, what are the ways that you would hope that they might use Black disability threat theory to sort of inform culturally responsive interventions to disrupt that school to prison nexus for Black students with disabilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I would want them to use it, the number 10, the conscious and concrete interventions. So think how we can to think creatively. Like for example, with the medical support staff on campuses being first responders is something I thought of that I really want to push for in California. And I think that, at the Scholar Strategy Network, they talked about if you had a magic wand, and you could do anything with policy, what would you do? So I think asking those kinds of questions of teachers, like if you could do anything to improve the lives of disabled Black Americans, what would you do? Would you, defund police? What would you do? So yeah, I think I'm still thinking about that. What can we do? I tried to include in that paper a lot of policy directions and research ideas. Um, and I also think critical theory is really important, like thinking about what kind of theories you could create to help us think about problems and solutions, like critical race theory or Black disability threat theory, or there's so many other ones you can think of that only you can do. That, for example, I wouldn't think of. So yeah, I'm still thinking about that. That's a really great question. I'm still trying to find the answer. I feel like that's like the theme.
Thanks so much.
All right. Well, thank you so much all for coming and spending an hour with me. I really appreciate you all. And yeah, you can always email me. I'll drop my email into the chat. And you can find me by just looking up my name. But if you have any questions or comments or advice, I'm all ears.
Thank you, Dr. Templeton, for this wonderful talk and creating the space.
Thank you.
I also want to just highlight in the chat, I've sent some upcoming spring 2025 programs that we are hosting. So if you would like to join us for any of those upcoming sessions, please feel free to go ahead and register yourself for those. Thank you again to Dr. Templeton, and have a great rest of the day, everyone.
Thank you.